The air in the chamber beneath the palace of Nineveh was thick with the scent of cedar oil and something darker, something that clung to the stone walls like a memory that refused to fade. This was not the sharp, animal terror of soldiers facing death on a battlefield. This was different, colder, more absolute. The kind of fear that comes when you realize that everything you were has ended, that your name will be erased from history, that your body has become property, catalogued and counted like livestock. The gods you prayed to your entire life cannot reach you here, carved into bedrock beneath the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. And tonight, in this chamber, a queen would cease to exist. The walls were covered in carved reliefs, visible even in the dim lamplight that flickered across the stone. They showed kings of Assyria receiving tribute from conquered peoples, cities burning, prisoners impaled on stakes that stretched toward an indifferent sky. And woven through these scenes of conquest, repeated again and again like a terrible hymn, were images of women, kneeling, veiled, hands bound, queens stripped of their crowns, princesses torn from palaces, royal daughters transformed into possessions, their names recorded on clay tablets alongside gold and ivory and grain, as if human beings could be reduced to inventory, as if sovereignty could be erased with administrative efficiency. In the center of the chamber stood a stone basin filled with water that caught the lamplight and threw dancing reflections across the ceiling. The water was not for drinking, it was not for ordinary washing. This was ritual purification, the kind that transforms one thing into another, that marks the boundary between what was and what will be. The process by which a woman who had been a queen, who had commanded servants and issued decrees and worn the symbols of divine authority, would be transformed into something the Assyrians had a specific word for in their administrative tablets: property of the palace. 3 words that erase lineage and identity and everything that came before. Beside the basin stood a eunuch named Nebuchadnezzar. He was perhaps 40 years old, though his smooth face made age difficult to determine. He had been castrated as a boy after his own city fell to Assyrian conquest, raised in the palace to serve in the royal household, trained to oversee the bit Assyrian. The women's quarters were captured queens and foreign princesses, and the daughters of vassal kings lived out their remaining years in silence and shadow. He had witnessed this transformation ceremony dozens of times, but tonight was different. Tonight, the woman being prepared was not some minor princess from a small kingdom that history would forget. Tonight it was the queen of Elam herself, brought to Nineveh in chains after her kingdom burned, after her husband was executed, after everything she had known was destroyed. She stood before the basin wearing the torn remains of her royal clothing, though the crown and jewels had already been stripped away. Her name was inscribed in cuneiform on a clay tablet that lay on a wooden table beside the basin. Tomorrow, that tablet would be dissolved in water, the clay returning to formless mud, her original name disappearing as though it had never existed. She would be given a new name, a generic title that could apply to any woman, that carried no memory of her homeland or her lineage or the royal house she had been born into. What would happen to her over the following hours, the ritual that would mark her transition from queen to possession, was never recorded in full in Assyrian administrative texts. The scribes who documented everything else in meticulous detail, who counted jars of oil and recorded the names of horses and tracked tribute payments from distant provinces, maintained careful silence about the specifics of these transformation ceremonies. Later sources hint at practices that violated not just the dignity of the women involved, but every principle of sacred kingship that ancient Near Eastern cultures claimed to honor. But the details remained deliberately obscured, recorded only in fragments, whispered about by servants who had witnessed things they could not fully describe, preserved in the archaeological record through absences and silences that historians still struggle to interpret. What we know is this: these ceremonies happened regularly in the underground chambers of Assyrian palaces. They were conducted by eunuchs under the authority of the king. They involved water and oil and incense, and ritual formulas recited in Akkadian. And women who entered those chambers as queens emerged as nameless property, whose lives would never again be their own. The psychological and physical transformation was so complete that captured queens who had once commanded armies and negotiated treaties and ruled kingdoms became silent shadows, who moved through palace corridors without protest, without showing any sign of the persons they had been before Assyrian conquest destroyed their worlds. If you want to understand how systematic cruelty can be rationalized as religious duty, how intelligent people can design institutions that destroy human dignity while claiming divine sanction, then you need to hear this story all the way through. Subscribe now, because what you're about to learn exists in the archaeological record, in fragmentary texts, and in silences that speak louder than words. Leave a comment telling me what you know about ancient Assyria, because I guarantee this story goes deeper and darker than anything you learned in school. And watch until the end, because I'm going to tell you what happened when Nineveh finally fell, how the tables turned, how Assyrian royal women experienced the same fate they had inflicted on others for 3 centuries. But first, to understand what happened in that chamber, we need to go back to the beginning. The Assyrian Empire rose from the city of Ashur on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. For centuries, Assyria had been overshadowed by Babylon to the south and threatened by mountain peoples to the north and east. But beginning in the 9th century before Christ, a series of ruthlessly effective kings transformed Assyria into a military machine that would conquer everything from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Iran. These kings built their empire through systematic terror combined with administrative efficiency that was unprecedented in the ancient world. They didn't just conquer territories, they destroyed the psychological foundations that allowed conquered peoples to imagine resistance. The military tactics were brutal even by ancient standards. Assyrian armies practiced psychological warfare deliberately and systematically. They would besiege cities for months, slowly starving populations while building siege towers, and battering rams visible from the walls, letting defenders watch their doom approaching with mechanical inevitability. When cities fell, the punishment was designed to be memorable. Leaders were impaled on stakes. Populations were deported en masse to distant provinces where they would never see their homelands again. Cities were burned so thoroughly that nothing remained but ash and rubble. But the Assyrians understood that military conquest alone was insufficient for building a stable empire. They needed to destroy the legitimacy of conquered dynasties to make clear that previous rulers had lost divine favor, that their gods had abandoned them, that resistance was not just militarily hopeless, but spiritually condemned. And this is where the treatment of captured royal families, particularly queens and princesses, became central to Assyrian imperial ideology. When Assyrian armies conquered a kingdom, they didn't simply kill the royal family. That would have been simpler and in some ways more merciful. Instead, they took the king and queen and their children captive, transporting them to Assyria where they would serve as living demonstrations of Assyrian superiority. The defeated king might be paraded through the streets of Nineveh in chains, forced to kneel before the Assyrian king while crowds jeered. But what happened to captured queens was different, more systematic, more designed to destroy not just individuals, but the entire concept of legitimate opposition to Assyrian rule. These women were taken to the royal palaces, particularly the great palace complexes at Nineveh and Nimrud, where they were processed through a system that transformed them from queens into anonymous property. This system, the Bit Ashurti or women's quarters, was one of the most sophisticated instruments of control and degradation the ancient world produced. The archaeological evidence comes from multiple sources. Palace reliefs show captive women in processions, often veiled, hands bound or positioned in gestures of submission. Administrative tablets record lists of foreign women, carefully categorized by origin and status and assign specific roles within the palace household. And burial evidence from palace complexes shows female skeletons wearing jewelry from multiple different regions, suggesting these were women from conquered kingdoms who died in Assyrian captivity. But the most revealing evidence comes from what the Assyrians chose not to record: royal inscriptions that boast in elaborate detail about military victories maintain careful silence about what happened to captured queens after they arrived in Assyria, the scribes who documented everything else with obsessive precision simply stopped writing when it came to the specifics of how these women were processed and controlled. This silence is not accidental. It suggests that what happened in those palace chambers was considered either too sacred to record or too shameful to admit, even by Assyrian standards that accepted brutality as normal policy. Modern historians have pieced together the outlines from fragments. Captured queens were taken to underground chambers carved into bedrock, accessible only through guarded passages. The process involved multiple stages, each designed to remove another layer of their previous identity. Royal clothing and jewelry were removed. Hair might be cut or reshaped according to Assyrian custom. Bodies were washed in ritual basins using water mixed with oils and substances whose exact composition remains unknown. Then came the erasure of their names, dissolved on clay tablets in water, literally washing away their identities. They were given new names, typically generic titles that referenced Assyrian gods or could apply to any woman. The psychological impact of losing your name cannot be overstated. Names carried meaning in the ancient world. They connected you to ancestors, to gods, to place. Taking away a woman's name was taking away her connection to everything that had made her who she was. Then came the occupational stage. Captured queens were assigned tasks that inverted their previous status. Women who had commanded servants were put to work grinding grain for temple offerings. Women who had been served elaborate meals prepared food for others. The point was not economic, the point was psychological. Making a former queen perform menial tasks demonstrated that her previous status had been illegitimate, that the gods who had supposedly endorsed her rule had actually condemned her. They were often dedicated to Assyrian gods, particularly to Ashur and to Ishtar, the goddess who combined war and sexuality in ways that made her perfect for this purpose. This religious dedication transformed military conquest into religious victory, and these women lived in the Bit Ashurti for the rest of their lives, in spaces designed specifically for control. High walls, limited access points guarded by eunuchs, internal layouts that made escape impossible, windows that looked inward to courtyards rather than outward to the city. The Bit Ashurti was simultaneously palace and prison. In 647 years before Christ, when the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal destroyed Elam, the Elamite queen was brought to Nineveh and processed through this system. The reliefs show what happened: the desecration, the ritual transformation, the complete erasure of who she had been. For 3 centuries, Assyria inflicted this fate on countless royal women, using their degradation as proof of divine favor. But empires built on terror eventually faced their own reckoning. When Nineveh fell in 612 before Christ, when Babylonian and Median armies broke through the walls and burned the palaces, the Assyrian royal women experienced everything their predecessors had inflicted on others. The chambers where queens had been transformed became chambers where Assyrian princesses faced the same fate. The system turned upon itself with perfect, terrible symmetry. What happened in those underground chambers beneath Nineveh represents something darker than simple cruelty. It was systematic degradation elevated to state policy, wrapped in religious justification, administered with bureaucratic efficiency. And the silence in the records, the careful omission of details suggests that even those who designed this system understood on some level that what they were doing crossed lines that should never be crossed, that some victories come at a cost to the soul that no amount of conquered territory can justify. What do you think drove civilizations to create such systems? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on how power and cruelty became so intertwined in the ancient world. And remember, the silences in history often speak louder than the words that survived. What we choose not to record reveals as much about us as what we choose to preserve.